Close enough?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our today's session. Today we are going to have a discussion on the environmental crisis that is plaguing the whole world. And I think this is the most pressing problem of the time. And this is not an ideological battle that will have a winner and loser. This is going to affect all of the humanity, regardless of what ideology, religion, or whatever we subscribe to. So today we have with us Dr. Matthew Copeland. I took a class with him last term and it was online. Not to say anything against online classes, but he made it as fun as it was possible. And after having that class, I got the idea of hosting this session so that those in Bangladesh can actually have some sort of idea of what the environmental crisis is actually about and when did it originate and how it progressed over the time and what are the challenges of addressing this issue. So welcome, Matthew.
Well, thank you very much for setting this up. I think it's a really good idea, Fahim. From last term when you had the class to now, it seems like your own interest in stuff has grown immensely. I think it's a very good idea. A big part of what we do to address environmental things, I think, at the moment is educating people, because it's the case that many people really don't know at the moment what's going on and how quickly it's happening, and of course, even fewer know what to do about it. So I'm very happy to participate.
So okay, Matthew. So could you just, in brief, summarize how it originated and like what was the foundational moment of the present crisis?
Okay. Well, what we're talking about is global warming, climate change, and human-induced climate change. And there are different ways of looking at the problem. And when we talked about it in class, I was trying to look at the skeptics. There are still those who believe that this is just a function of Earth geology and just cooling and heating cycles. But most of the science at the moment makes it pretty clear that no, we're locked into some sort of global warming that's a bit more the result of human development and human stuff over the past number of centuries. And one way of looking at this, a long-term view, is once we begin to move into agriculture, we of course begin to rework the planet in all kinds of ways that works for us but might not be good for the ecosystem as a whole. But another view that's probably the most correct one is the extent to which we begin to take fossil fuels and make that the basis for our economic development. And that you can trace back to 18th century England, the use of coal to power first pumps and then looms, and then after that a whole battery of other machines to move us into a fossil fuel-based economy. People these days are referring to fossil capitalism, the decision to build a capitalistic system based upon fossil fuel use in industry and increasingly for pretty much everything. And the problem with this is the Earth has a carbon cycle. Carbon is everywhere. We're made of carbon. Plants are made of carbon. But a lot of the carbon associated with our planet is locked up in carbon stores, carbon sinks, where it's supposed to be. And in the process of burning or using things, we've been releasing carbon and a number of other greenhouse gases back into the atmosphere in a way that ultimately has been contributing to shifts in our atmospheric content in a way that's slowly heating the planet. When I say slowly heating the planet, there's a debate about how quickly that temperature rise is occurring, and debates about what different temperature rises will do. If we look at, say, a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, of course, that's a median. We take temperatures around the planet and say it could rise this high, and we can look at the consequences of that. The problem with median temperatures, of course, is some people live closer to the equator where it's likely to get much hotter, much quicker. That median rise doesn't mean everyone will experience a 2 degree temperature increase. It means some places will be quite hot, while other places are increasing in temperature at a slower rate. And the immediate concerns here are two things. One is global temperature increases, apart from making some places increasingly arid and less livable, shifting rainfall patterns and stuff. We're also looking at ice melt, and not just sea ice, but ice on land masses like Greenland, glacier melt, and that ice flows down to the ocean and contributes to an overall sea level rise. Another part of this, of course, is if you heat water, it expands. And the net outcome of this, of course, is sea levels that are likely to increase fairly gradually, but in a way that ultimately will inundate lots of places that sit close to the ocean. So this problem of sea level rise associated with global warming is one big problem. There's a second problem related to that. Of course, if we look at what happens when you have large amounts of carbon sitting adjacent to the ocean, you get a phenomenon known as ocean acidification. And that basically means the ocean water itself becomes increasingly acidic, and it begins to undermine not just things that we're seeing now like coral reefs, but also little creatures that all other marine life depends upon, shellfish and crustaceans and things. They can't make their shells. It's likely to undermine the entire basis of the ocean ecology if we don't put a stop to it fairly rapidly. So just to reiterate that long thing, you're looking at something that begins really with industrialization that spreads out of Europe in a certain time frame, and that now leads us to a present that seemingly poses a threat to not just everyone, but in particular, folks living in warmer climates closer to the equator, folks living adjacent to ocean areas at sea level, and also anybody who relies upon the ocean as a source of food, and many, many, many people do. Those are some of the bigger issues at the moment.
So basically what you are saying is, if we look at the bigger picture, then we could possibly say that the global warming has started since the Neolithic Revolution with the introduction of agriculture, but things really started to accelerate after the invention of fossil fuel driven economy, the capitalist economic system, and it was led by the Imperial Britain. And then we now have this sort of problems that we're talking about. So before we get into the details of each and all of these problems, let me just ask, so was there any ideological change that enabled 18th century England to do what it did?
Very much so. You can actually look at choices made by folks who owned the factories to deal with human labor and the problems of artisan labor in particular, demanding higher wages, or to begin to mechanize and opt for machines that were far more easy to control. And in fact, you could push labor out, or skilled labor, and bring in cheap labor that could then be utilized to man looms. Child labor, for example, could be brought in instead of skilled labor. Choices were made on behalf of the folks who owned the factories. And of course, some of those choices actually in the outset initially involved a higher investment than you might have had if you kept labor on board. It was a choice for mechanization over human labor. And those decisions set in train a process that, of course, is carried out to the rest of the world through imperialism. If we think of a later stage in this process, at the newly increased productive capacity of places like England or countries on the continent, continental Europe, they suddenly have a need for markets and raw materials that fuels European imperialism. And of course, that in turn takes a particular mode of production, a particular style of doing capitalism, and makes it not just a European thing, but a part of an integrated global economic thing. And as that comes up, of course, one of the big breakpoints in this, at that very moment where imperialism begins to come unraveled, country after country emerges to the fore as a newly independent nation state, and they also want to participate and have some of the things that you had in places like Europe or the West. And that means their own modern sectors, their own fossil fuel driven economies. A problem that begins in Europe and goes global then becomes truly a global problem. Now, no matter where you look, people are busily using no longer coal, but certainly petroleum and gas. And all of us want, for good reason, electricity. Where does that come from? Well, we have some renewables, but largely oil and gas and also coal. So the problem went from being small to being rather large and certainly global in scope. I'll give you an example of that. In the past 25 years, about half of all greenhouse gases have been put in the atmosphere. We've been talking about global warming really in a big way since the 70s. The UN has been looking at it as a problem since the 1980s. We've had climate debates among UN members really since the early 90s. But in that same time frame, from say 1992 on to now, we're still dumping stuff into the atmosphere at a rate an alarming rate that's accelerating the process. So we have a problem. We know we have a problem. We're talking about the problem, and it's getting markedly worse while we talk, which is, I think, the main reason why I decided to take it and bring it into classrooms and talk about it, is to get people aware of it and to realize that the time for talking is good, but maybe the time for action is at hand as well. That's how I see things.
So basically, from what I discern from your discussion, that there are three things we are looking at. So on the one hand, we have this capitalist economy that emerged in the 18th century, and the sort of arrangements that were needed to made before capitalist economy could actualize. So this is one aspect, and it was in Europe, and then it went global.
Right.
So now we have these other countries that are joining the international system after getting independence, maybe from colonial class and so on. So now they have their own model of development that are based on the capitalist economic system, and we have this problem.
Right.
But on the other hand, when we talk about the 18th century, and whatever it is, capitalism or the modern nation state system, we are eventually we're actually essentially talking about the Enlightenment period.
A little bit later than the Enlightenment, certainly the scientism that comes out of the Enlightenment decided that we can use our reason and apply it to solving problems in nature and in economics and stuff. The whole Industrial Revolution was a part and parcel of that. A bit later, really. Capitalism, trade, business had been around long before that, and of course wasn't a European invention. If we think of global trading networks, much of the world's economy was linked to an Indian Ocean trade and East Asian trade that predates a lot of what happens in Europe. Europe's particular contribution was developing this fossil fuel-based economic production system that does produce a huge surplus, a surplus that drops costs and makes a lot of life's conveniences available to folks at a cheaper price, but also comes at a cost. For example, labor pays a price, the environment pays a price, and ultimately, if you're thinking of capitalism on scale, you need materials and you need markets, and that sets in train a push for colonies, I guess, if you look at that process. England, with its looms, they didn't just produce for a home market using local resources. They got cotton from the United States, picked by slave labor. They turned to places like Egypt that also had cotton, and they began to produce stuff for global markets. That process of expansion, of course, gets you something that gets replicated in lots of places for good reason. I think most of us, if we look at things like electricity or off-the-rack shirts that you can buy cheaply, these are nice things. We like these things.
Yeah.
But the beginning of the consumer-driven economy, where we need things, we want things, we purchase things, and those things then are thrown away eventually, and we buy more stuff. The global economies we know it is pretty new, and big parts of it, of course, are still being brought up. I mean, if we think of development as a post-World War II phenomena, taking something that was working in Europe and making it a global thing, we're still in that. We're still caught up in that process, even though we can see the externalities associated with it, the costs to the environment and things.
So, but when we talk about it becoming a global thing, we tend to undermine the role that European countries, and maybe some would say that Anglophone countries, played in bringing about the present state of affairs. So, and also related with the idea of development. So, these countries who have benefited from fossil fuel, so they are already at a very good level of development. They have achieved that, and now they can lecture others on how to be environmentally sustainable, how to pursue a model of development that would not perhaps harm the environment. But they already have an advantage to begin with. So, what's this? How do you go about it? And what should the developing countries do? Whose responsibility is it?
Well, you're absolutely right, Fahim. It's quite political if you look at the developed versus the developing world. of course, it's fairly clear that development came at the cost of the developing world in many respects. If we look at imperialism as a net extractive process, of course, and it was, even if you had growth in colonial settings, a lot of the growth was repatriated back to home markets and whatnot. So there's that aspect of exploitation. Another problem, though, in the current global environment, you have global systems, and Wallerstein and other theorists looking at globalization would testify to this, centers that actually are more developed and still extract from the less developed world. So the whole global imbalance of the economy is one issue, inequity and developed versus developing. But on the carbon emissions front, the countries most responsible for atmospheric greenhouse gases are those countries that have already developed. If you look at the United States, for example, or Germany, or places like Japan, historically, they were net emitters of greenhouse gases. And even now, if they're moving over to greener technologies, and some are and some aren't, the stuff in the atmosphere that's causing global warming is largely a function of certain places and not others. Big parts of the Earth's population are folks still living in underdeveloped settings where they don't actually emit much in the way of greenhouse gases. They still rely upon biomass for their cooking fuels and things like that. So some people are clearly more to blame for this problem than others, although laying blame doesn't necessarily help us to address the problem. It does raise questions about equity, though. If we're looking at development, should all places be allowed to grow rapidly, or should the developed world sort of step down and possibly even de-develop for the sake of the developing world to allow some of the benefits and wealth from industrial production to accumulate to folks who haven't enjoyed it, even if it means increasing greenhouse gas emissions and stuff like that. I'll give you an example there. China in recent decades has become a global leader in greenhouse gas emissions, but China also has a huge population that, at least until the 1980s, was predominantly poor. Since then, they've done a reasonably good job of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's come at an environmental expense. And to their credit, the current government is now committed to trying to back away from greenhouse gas emissions and promote renewables and also other types of technologies that might create less of an environmental impact. But that problem, of course, developed countries are the first to criticize developing countries that suddenly become net emitters of greenhouse gases. Another problem, and this is fairly easy to see, if we have rising sea levels or places that become increasingly unlivable because of climate change, we can look at large numbers of folks who will be forced to migrate out of their current environments and live somewhere else. Climate refugees. It's a new category discussed in the UN for some time. In 2018, they at least reached an agreement that there should be some sort of agreement on climate refugees, but they, for the moment, don't have any sort of implementing legislation. I'll give you an example close to home. Bangladesh is, of course, at sea level and subject already to flooding and storm surges. In the event of a sea level rise, large parts of Bangladesh will be inundated. Where do those people go if they're not welcome in neighboring India or in Myanmar? Who looks after them? Who's responsible for them? One argument, of course, is that the countries that created the problem should be the countries that then take responsibility for at least alleviating some of the suffering caused by the problem. That, to my mind, is a reasonable argument.
But when we talk about climate refugee, so I think much of the academic literature on this regard is basically focused on the Western European countries. Like they basically talk from a vantage point of living in the so-called West.
Right.
So, and they also their works are actually sometimes have this underlying assumption that they're trying to help the states cope up with the climate change and its concomitants like the climate refugee.
Right.
But they do not talk from the point of view of a refugee. For example, what happens, like, yes, we can relocate the climate refugee from these affected countries to somewhere in the West, perhaps, or some developed country. But what happens to their culture? What happens to their society? I mean, we cannot just extract the biological being, like the organisms. The humans are humans only when we look at them in a particular context.
Right.
So this literature, to me, sometimes suggests that we are trying to look at these biological living beings, but not the souls themselves.
It's a very good point. I mean, part of that problem, if we back up a bit, I think it's safe to say that human beings, Homo sapiens, we're a migratory species. All of us come from somewhere else, presumably from similar origins a long, long time ago. And in the past, at least prior to hard borders and modern nation states, we could leave. We could move from places of relative scarcity and want to places where food and livelihoods were a bit more abundant and a bit easier. And that process got us a mixing of peoples over time. And that, I think, is the history of most people in most places. The problem with the modern interstate system, of course, is it privileges the authority of nation states to either allow people in or out of their borders. And that, whatever the utility of that in the 20th century, we're looking at a range of problems right now that make that no longer feasible, to my mind. If you find people living in places that are no longer habitable, they're going to move. They will go. And of course, one would hope that for the sake of their culture and community, that they'd be allowed to resettle en masse in other places, that would be taken into consideration. If we look at some of the more recent tragedies, of course, you can look to places like Syria in recent years, where drought triggered conflict, civil war that then led to massive migrations of people who were simply trying to live a peaceful life. And of course, their arrival in places was met with growing concern about their numbers, and ultimately it led to repatriation back to places like Turkey, where large numbers of folks are being held in camps. It works for no one, certainly not for the refugees themselves. So it's a very difficult problem, but it's one that sadly, because of climate change and global warming, I think we'll be facing in increasing numbers. The whole question of people moving, needing to move because they can no longer live where they're living. And sadly, the folks most likely to be disrupted by this are the folks in poorer nations, poorer settings, the developing world. So all I can say on that point is that really the developed world rightly is responsible and rightly should take a lead, take a role in trying to alleviate, address some of the problem, I think. That would be my take on it.
Matthew, so from the responses that we are getting, could you please first explain what the concept of climate refugee is? Because to many, it is not very clear, because it's not always the case that the sea level rises and homes are now under the sea, and that's why they are having to leave. For example, in Syria, that's obviously not the case, but these are complex web of many factors that are forcing them to leave from where they were. So it is not always very much present, but latent. So could you please elaborate on that?
Sure. Some categories of refugee are pretty easy to understand, like a political refugee, someone fleeing conflict, someone whose life is in danger if they stay in their country of origin, folks who need to go if they're going to live, oftentimes because they're either of targeted minorities or political oppositions and they need to go. Other categories of refugees are a bit broader, and they're not really refugees at all. They're migrants. If we think of economic migrants, millions of people move around the planet every year for economic reasons, and if they're affluent and educated, they're oftentimes welcomed by host countries that are looking forward to having them come in and contribute to the economy. Climate refugees is something new, and of course, defining them becomes quite problematic, because oftentimes the definition process is left to the country that they're trying to get into. For example, folks massing on the border of country X might be legitimate climate refugees, but if country X doesn't recognize them as such, they don't necessarily have to let them in. What would a climate refugee be? Let's suppose you're a farmer who once a year relies on rainfall to come so that you can grow staple crops to feed your family. and also to fill local ponds and creeks to allow you to get through the rest of the year. When the rains stop because of shifting rainfall patterns, when desertification begins and the area that you're living in becomes increasingly dry and barren and you can no longer grow crops there, you can no longer sit there and farm. You become heavily dependent on external aid, and there are many such countries already on the planet where people rely upon international aid and assistance to survive, food assistance. Afghanistan is a very good example of a place with lots of people who are basically aid dependent. Either the international community continues to provide them with aid on the ground and alleviate suffering on the ground, or other arrangements need to be made. And sometimes that can involve retraining and introduction of drought-resistant crops and things. But increasingly, if we look at climate change, it means big parts of certain countries might no longer be able to sustain agrarian populations in the way that they used to. Thailand, where we're at right now, is a good example of a place that has the brunt of the majority of its population in the rural northeast, an area that previously had teak forests. Those were cut off some time back, and the upland plateau that is left is a place that has had ever diminishing rainfall. As of late, it's been in chronic drought mode. When rain comes, of course, and this is another facet of climate change, oftentimes the storms are bigger, more intense, they carry more rain, and they create not only wind damage, but a flash flood damage. In short, the most populous farm area in Thailand is now no longer a place where people can easily farm. Migration could take one of two forms here: domestic migration down to Bangkok to look for work, assuming Bangkok can absorb literally millions of new untrained workers. But another thing would be, of course, to look for work in neighboring countries. That's what Cambodians are doing in Thailand. Southern Cambodia is experiencing the same problem, and a big part of the migration into Thailand to work is fueled by folks who can no longer farm in their home country. That sort of migration is a function of folks who would, if they could, do what they did. It's not the case that people willingly leave their homes. But when your home is no longer habitable, when you can no longer farm there, when you can no longer feed your kids, yep, people go. They sort of have to. So
when we talk about immigration or migration, so there's a saying that when one door closes, another door opens. So, and I have seen some cases, some documentaries in which it is featured that Russians, for example, are very much happy about climate change. Their climate is getting warmer, and
right.
This is comfy for them,
right.
Much more comfortable. So can we say it's climate change? Should we let that happen because we can move northwards, probably?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Russia may be one of the only countries on the planet that's happy about developments. and also, Putin is very happy that he has at his fingertips a heavy supply of petrochemicals and gas that he can sell on to other countries. So they're not big champions of worrying about climate change at the moment. No, but most places, and certainly places right around the equator, we're looking at places that will become so hot that people working outside will rapidly become dehydrated and subject to all kinds of related problems. Not everyone can afford an air conditioner. If they could, it wouldn't help the problem because air conditioners need electricity to go. So you're looking at a belt around the center of the earth that's likely to suffer. And sadly, it carries a big part of our population. If we look beyond people, and I think we should, because when we look at complex ecosystems, we're just a part of a bigger, broader natural environment. Species loss now is happening at a phenomenal rate. And of course, how many different things can disappear before the entire ecosystem bellies up is a real issue. I mentioned at the beginning of our talk, the ocean. A lot of people rely on the ocean for food. A lot of fish rely on certain things in the ocean for their food. If ocean acidification reaches a certain level, we're looking at food security issues for marine life and the people who rely on marine life. And these problems with food security, of course, exacerbate other problems. If I live in a country that's arid, at least I can catch fish. If I can no longer farm and I can no longer fish, what do I do? Sort of stuff. So I'm thinking the loss of plant and animal life is also a concern, because for most of human history, that was our food source. We relied on these things. And in the pre-farming days, of course, we relied entirely on these things. And now, even with farming systems, diminished output from farming at a time where human populations are increasing, it doesn't bode well for food security around the planet, particularly for the poor.
So what you are basically saying is the world is, I mean, the rest of the world is going to be destroyed sooner than the Russia, for example, getting comfortable.
Right.
So this is a risk that we cannot take. So
right.
What are the solutions? So we have talked about the problems and how we got here.
Right.
Also got where we are now. But what are the solutions? So one of the solutions is let science fix that. But that to many is a problem because it is scientism which is responsible for the crisis. So to allow science to take charge of, say, the action against environmental crisis is like letting the responsible fix it. I mean, the one who theft it, and so basically asking him to oversee the damage repair thing. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I get your point. I know a lot of people, in fact, a lot of my students believe that, oh, this isn't a big problem because we don't have a solution for some of this at hand, but don't worry, science will solve this for us. For example, if cars are polluting today, that's all right. We'll develop green cars, and we already are moving towards hybrids and stuff. We can fix this stuff. I'm a believer, I think, that indeed well-intentioned people in the sciences probably will fix such things as they can fix. But I think the problem is a bit bigger than inadequate tech. It's not just a technological thing. If we think of global economics, we built a system predicated upon the use of fuels, fossil fuels, and even if we get over to green technology fairly rapidly, and that's a question, that's a big if, we're still looking at a system that's predicated upon endless extraction from a finite system in order to produce consumer goods for a global economy that's premised upon consumption and consuming stuff, using it up and producing some more. If we look at growth models, it's all predicated upon this understanding. And of course, the principal driving force of global economy at the moment is private capital. Whatever debate you had in the 20th century about ownership models, that debate has seemingly been resolved in favor of private capital, which in turn is driven by a profit motive. That whole system is in place and very difficult to shut down or alter or change because that's where much of the wealth and much of the decision making is made. We could look to national governments, we could look to the UN, but in truth, a fair amount of the capital sits with companies that now have market capitalization far in excess of any nation state. If we look at Apple, I think a couple of weeks back, reached the $2 trillion capitalization mark, like a global record. That's a big company. And, you know, I'm just picking Apple out of a pile of big companies, but when you get to that level of wealth, of course, their choices about where they build their stuff, how they build their stuff, how they sell their stuff, all of that is sort of beyond regulatory authority. And we live in an age where people everywhere admire their products and would like to have some of their stuff. So if you look at things like that, I think it's a bit more than just trying to figure out how to get a clean energy base. We're looking at a system that, I mean, basically is not in line with a finite global resource base. We need to sort of think of, if we're looking at sustainability, how to sort of put back in what we take out in a way that will sort of stabilize our relationship with the earth.
But some scientists are like coming up with some creative solutions like sustainable cities, not horizontal ones, but vertical ones, and these sort of things. And they're proposing new models of like rearranging how we have envisioned human society hitherto. So do you think these are going to like bear any fruitful result, or this is a risk that we cannot take? Like if one vertical city fails, like it will basically exterminate a large number of human population. I mean, probably if that happens, if we actually go down that path, then that will mean that we will have lost significant proportion of human colony.
Mm.
So it will also decrease our chance of surviving as a species.
Mm.
So,
well, I think there are a million different things we can do, and the easiest one, spot out, is afforestation. I mean, plant a tree. This sounds overly simplistic, but trees are made of carbon stuff, and when they grow, they actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere. I mean, there are all kinds of things that one can do. Building materials, there's a whole revolution underway in terms of building material and design. It needn't be a vertical city, but you can actually use environmentally safe, environmentally sound building materials that things like cement and glass are not. I mean, if you think of how we build our cities right now, they carry a very heavy carbon footprint. Lots of things can be done. And of course, we can and should do those things, even if there's some risk involved, because to not do these things leaves us on a trajectory that almost all accounts say leads us down the path to some fundamental changes in our climate that will have disastrous consequences for us. I mean, most projections out to 2050 or 2100. If we don't get things under control, we're looking at total ice melt, huge inundations of land areas where we now live, a shift in our global food production that you can't just move further north. The best soils are now in certain places, and if you shift north, you can't actually grow the same crops. Areas where animals and things won't live anymore. One of the things about fish is if the water gets too hot, they leave. They can. They don't wait, and that means some folks in northern climes will get such remaining fish stocks as they're out there. Folks who used to live on fisheries in hotter climates, not so much. So we're looking at stuff that we have to address. We cannot ignore it, and by whatever means, scientific, technological, or other, we probably should be looking at it that way. But I think the bigger problem, of course, is still sustainability and how we choose to conceive of that. Low growth or slow growth or equitable growth societies where we actually look to the needs of everyone, not just to some folks at the top, creating a gap that then needs to be addressed by pulling the bottom up, and also a similar relationship between the developed and developing world. It's simply not fair or feasible that some places can act as a model and a beacon of lifestyles for other people to emulate when there's very little hope that the developing world will ever get there. I mean, if you think of sitting in an affluent place and serving as a model for how everything should be, it's quite a problem, I think. So equity turns up in this too.
But don't you think that the present crisis has also given us an opportunity to rethink how we organize the world system? For example, it is very clear that the developing world is at the disadvantage here.
Right.
And not everyone is affected the same way by climate change. And when we speak of Russia, we clearly know that they are very glad to have it.
Right.
I mean, they are trying to accelerate the process. Right. So don't you think that this gave the developing world and parts of the developing world the mental, the ethical capacity to ask the developed world, somehow rearrange how they are living and change their trajectory, perhaps? So up until now, the most of the discourse around environmental activism have been produced in the West and by the West, and so they are somewhat thought of as the ideological provider of the environmental activism thing. But don't you think because of the disparity that the climate change is creating, and how in different ways it is affecting different parts of the world, so this situation can change?
Well, I do think it can change, and I don't need to be pessimistic about it. I think a couple of things that we're facing right now that make it difficult to change. One, continued human population growth and growth in those very parts of the world where seemingly you can least afford to have growth, economies that seemingly can't absorb the people. Urbanization is another component of that. People are being born in farming sectors that no longer can support them, and they're moving to cities. Urbanization is an ongoing process, and most of the cities that are out there are environmentally far more problematic than rural areas. So we have some trends and things that are a bit alarming, and seemingly people being people, we're very resilient. We tolerate things that rightly should not be tolerated, and oftentimes it almost requires a shock, some dramatic thing to shake us out of our safety zone. And in lots of places, it requires air that you can barely breathe, and people who are beginning to die from bad air before they recognize that, hey, we can't deal with this. If you think of this problem of how much people can tolerate, of course, poor people in particular are trained to tolerate a lot. So I'm thinking the recognition that some of this is insufferable, this cannot go on. All of that, I think, is out there. Another problem for me personally, I look at the natural environment, and I like, I mean, apart from my own species, lots of other plants and animals, and I think if we are not careful, it will be too late for many, many, many things that live on the planet. I think people are bright enough and resilient enough that we will survive this, but many of the other things that live with us on the Earth might not be so lucky. I mean, indeed, extinction rates are increasing and stuff. So on that front, I'm less pessimistic. But do I believe we can ultimately overcome this? Yes, I think so. What's required to get from where we are to there? Not just an awareness of things, but a willingness to sort of rethink our relative priorities, I guess. And I think that might be easier for folks in non-secular settings. In the secular world, we tend to look at politics and economics and mainstream that, but at least if you're coming at the planet from a religious perspective, there are some other values and norms that might be seen as being more important than that. And of course, that could be a way of regrouping, placing values on things that are maybe bigger or more important than our own profit and well-being and our own political position and stuff. That might be a way forward, I think. But my immediate worry, I think, is if we don't do something pretty quick. I have children, and when I think of what they'll experience in their lifetime without us intervening to stop things, I get a little worried about that on a personal level.
So we are talking about what course of action should we take, or
right.
Yeah, what do we have to take, and this eventually basically leads us to the dilemma of development and this sort of thing, and we also have the difference of interests of the developed world and the developing world. So it is basically about the international system we are talking about. So what do you think that should we approach the climate change issue, the environmental crisis, from single country perspective, like each country should deal with its own problem on its own, or do we take a regional or maybe a global approach to that? And how do you envision that approach should be?
Well, I'm thinking that one of the tragedies of where we're at right now is we lived in a world that was fractured along civilizational lines, and also, if we think of European imperialism, one that had imperial networks that tended to be relatively insular. But coming out the other side of that, of course, we entered into the age of the nation state, and national sovereignty tends to trump every other concern. Individual governments are free to do what they want. The truth is, on global environmental issues, we're in this together. And that's why the UN could be a focal point for us to collaborate. And that's why some of the better science and reportage and stuff has been done under the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, people working together to figure out what's happening, step A, and then looking collectively at how it can be alleviated, what can be done. But that's something where we really need to work together, because the complexity of the global system is such so that any one group of scientists working in any corner of the planet really can only get a partial view. So I'm thinking assessing the problem and addressing the problem is, at the end of the day, something we need to collaborate on, we need to work together on, and that makes it quite tough in the age of nation states. We can reach agreements at the UN level, but we have no enforcement capability. Can't think of a better example than the Trump administration's departure from the Paris Accords of 2015 and deciding in 2016 that they didn't want to be party to that. That should not be allowed to happen. It just should not be allowed to happen. So,
can I look at the comments that we are getting? Yeah. It seems that there is no comment so far.
Okay. That's all right.
But we have viewers, right? Yeah. 8 of them right now.
Okay.
We're basically at the end of, towards the end of our discussion. So basically what you were saying is we don't have the luxury of approaching climate change one by one, like each country on its own. So we have to be here collectively. But given the circumstance, like if we look at the UN Security Council, so in theory, all states are equal. Like if we look at the Westphalian conceptualization of the world system, but in reality, like 5 countries are bigger than other countries.
For sure.
So, is it possible, like in the current framework, to mobilize resources and mobilize countries that matter?
Right.
Like it doesn't matter what maybe Thailand or Bangladesh, countries like these do, but it matters what the United States is doing.
Well, so, I mean, you talk, and of course one can talk about the West versus other parties. One of the things about global environmentalism, or even communities of scientists around the planet, is they constitute a network in their own right. And to the extent that you have folks collaborating together, it might be below the level of the nation state. It could be as communities of scientists. That in itself can constitute a sort of lobby. I think we should perhaps not leave too much to individual governments, many of which for structural reasons are more concerned about economic growth and development than they are a battery of other issues. If you look at environmentalism and concern over climate change and stuff, we're looking at a single issue that could effectively serve as a basis for a global lobby. And one way to make that lobby work is to reach across borders and to educate people and to bring people up to speed and let them see that this is a collective problem, one where they need to talk to their own political leaders and their own economic leaders and rethink things. And of course, this involves people in the business community too. They're not all evil, profit-oriented folks. Many of them have kids and want the planet to survive. And so how do you get people to become increasingly cognizant of and willing to act on an awareness of what we've done and what we need to do? And that can be below the level of the state, but certainly can be international. It doesn't have to necessarily be a function of states or even the UN. The UN is a good place to talk and a good place to build coalitions. But at the end of the day, we have at our disposal, and we're using it right here, some amazing technology to sort of reach across borders and talk to people about ideas that matter and persuade people, and change, of course, is first a function of understanding the problem, and then in different ways and in different places, working out a solution. And I think all of us can contribute to that in small ways or large ways. But yeah, I agree with you. The UN has heretofore been very ineffective. They've been looking at this since the 1980s. They've got multiple accords and multiple meetings and stuff. And thus far, we've got some very good reportage, some very good scientific studies, but no effective mechanism for imposing on members of the global community a common set of actions. There's no bite to the bark, if you will. So, yeah.
So this has been a very informative session, and I hope that this session will allow people in Bangladesh to look at the environmental crisis in a different way than the way we have been looking before, and to really understand what the systematic changes that we are having to bring in order to challenge this, not just any particular aspect, this or that. So thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Fahim. I'm glad you're doing this. It's a very good project. So happy to help. So
yeah, probably on another topic, I will invite you again.
Happy to help.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us today. Khuda Hafiz. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks. Wow. So am I going to